Yeah, we got the granddaughter with us today, so Jackie. Mr. Adkins, how are you?
Well, let's begin this morning. And as usual, let's begin with prayer. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to understand your book better and to understand how we fit into this life that you've given to us as a gift. Help us remember our responsibilities to it and not only to understand your word, but to live it. We thank you for yourself, your Son, your Spirit, and your Scriptures. Amen. So, the Declaration of Independence probably has one specific phrase that is seared into the mindset of every single American, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is, of course, to us sacrosanct, which means it's sacred to us as Americans. And especially that last line, the pursuit of happiness. Of course, the pursuit of happiness that we think about and what it originally meant are two totally different things. But most Americans go on with their lives in thinking that this doesn't really matter at all. We'll get back to that in just a moment. But it's important for us to begin with the Declaration as we think about what does it mean to be happy, because that's what this passage is all about here this morning. Speaking of happiness, this is what we hear all the time. Pick a movie. Pick a television series. How many times do I talk to the screen when I hear people say, "Oh, we just want you to be happy. Oh, that's all we want is for you to be happy." Oh, gag. My word, I want to throw up every time I hear that. How many times have you heard this? This is a constant refrain everywhere, no matter what. You hear this all the time. And this is, of course, one of those things that comes in our culture that says this is what we want happiness to be. But is that what happiness is supposed to be all about? Of course, I have to pick on Hallmark because this is a regular occurrence on Hallmark. It is not as if, however, that I sit and watch Hallmark movies all the time. I just know the general gist of this thing that goes round and round, and the same kinds of ideas come up all the time. We just want you to be happy. That's all we care about. Well, I actually hear this on the campus where I teach. In fact, one student reported this kind of occurrence where she was in a conclave she was with faculty, she was working a desk, and she overheard one of the faculty actually say, "You know, I just got a promotion, I just had my latest research published, I have all of these things going for me, all of these accolades." And then she ended all of this by saying, "Is this all that there is? Is this what happiness is all about?" So even on the university campus, you can hear these kinds of statements being suggested all the time. And of course, people want the happiness to fulfill or fill that void, which is what we're talking about here in Ecclesiastes, but we find it everywhere. It's not just in one place, but it is indeed everywhere. So, what does happiness really mean? What is happy? Today, most people would suggest to you that by happiness they mean simply hedonism, which is a personal fulfillment of whatever they think they need or they want. Or, if we just put it simply, it is the big difference between needs and greeds. Those are the two things essentially that run our lives. But of course, when we're talking about happiness, it's all about us. And what Francis Schaeffer, who is somebody who greatly influenced my life as a young person, has well suggested that the real problem in the West is with personal peace and affluence. This is what we want. We don't want anybody to bother us. We want the comforts that we've established for ourselves, and we really don't want to go out of our way to deal with anybody else. So happiness is an attitude that says that pain is literally a four-letter word. We don't want pain. We do everything in our power to extricate ourselves from it. We want to be left alone. Don't ask too much of me. I want to spend the time I have to do whatever it is that I want. It is all about the I, the capital I. And that is what happiness is in American life in our culture today. But then we come to Ecclesiastes. And what does Solomon suggest? That the pursuit of happiness can become the pursuit of emptiness. And that's the essence of this. And we want to make sure to read this passage because it really stands out in our thinking as we read it out loud. This is Ecclesiastes 2, 1 through 11 from the English Standard Version. I said in my heart, "Come now, I'll test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself." But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, "It's mad," and of pleasure, "What use is it?" I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than anyone who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. And then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Well, is happiness, the pursuit of happiness, what we should be all about? Ultimately, it comes to emptiness, especially verse 11. It's like a punch in the face when we read that final line where we see this stuff stacked up one on top of each other. Vanity, chasing after the wind, and then ultimately, this is all something that's done under the sun, and there is no longevity to it at all. So, the first few verses, this is Solomon. I want to find out for myself. The word test here means that he poured himself into the process. Literally, he took the plunge to make sure that he could do as much and go as far as he possibly could go. Now, there are two different kinds of groups that are mentioned here in these verses, which is really fascinating to me. One of them is the working class group, where the word party has become a verb, or as we like to say in our generation today, let's partay, which is a general overview of having a good time, and you can fill that with whatever you would like. But bottom line is, we see this, let's say, for instance, in a sitcom like Young Sheldon, who is coming from a working class kind of family. Folks take this kind of direction when they want to drown their sorrows, when they have a loss of judgment. Maybe this kind of concept comes out of the hills. Maybe hillbillies might be associated with this idea. And maybe those of you who like country music remember Red Solo Cup. And this, of course, this kind of concept of, I just want to have a good time, I want to drink, I want to be merry, I want to fulfill my own and satiate my own lusts. So this is one extreme where he focuses on folly. He's just after partying. That's all he wants to do. By the way, there's a gerbil ramp that runs between the main hall, one of the halls where I teach at IUPUI, and the campus center. And I just noticed in the last couple of weeks they have a big poster on one of the windows in this place going from one building to the next. And it says, it has been discovered that IUPUI is not a party school. So I just wanted you to know that up front. For those of you concerned about party schools, we are not one. We're there to study. We take this thing seriously. All right. Now, there's a whole other group going on here. If you read these verses carefully, this is the group that is the wealthy class. So there's a distinction here in these verses between the working class and the wealthy class. It's almost as if he went between both classes to kind of experience it all. In this one, we see the whining and the dining going on. This is where all the folks with all the money, you know, have those really nice bar tables where you kind of stand around and you sip drinks and all that kind of stuff. And you have free bar and all of those kinds of things. Or is it open bar? I forget these things. Yeah, thank you. Somebody who knows. We won't make a big deal out of who said that. This is ultimately what The Great Gatsby is about. This summer, a young man I was tutoring this summer to help him get through literature and so on. He had to read this book, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And we were talking about it. And he said, well, what did you think of the book? Asking me. And I said, well, I hated the book. And he said, why did you hate the book? And I said, because Fitzgerald wanted me to hate the book. And he said, what do you mean Fitzgerald wanted you to hate the book? I said, when you get to the end of the book, he wants you to not like any of these rich people. That's the essence of what Fitzgerald's trying to say with The Great Gatsby, that this wealthy class gets to the end of this and says, you know, what is this all that there is? And that's the end. Or if you go with the Rolling Stones, I get no satisfaction. You know, you can go that direction too. But ultimately, this is the essence of what Solomon has perceived in his life as he's gone after all of this. Remember, he took the plunge. He's all into this thing. And he could do it because he had the peace and the prosperity to actually do that. Go back to last week's lesson on the importance of this. In verses 3 and 9, however, we have to be very careful to note this, that Solomon stands apart, he checks it out, and he says, his wisdom has guided him and remained with me. It isn't as if he has lost his faculties. It's not as if he became so drunk and inebriated with all of this wine, women, and song that he totally lost any ability to see clearly what was going on around him. He kept his wits about him, as we might say. 10 times the word I is used. Solomon's achievements, lifestyles of the rich and famous, or the rich housewives of fill in the blank. I saw from on a commercial this week from Salt Lake City now, I guess. We've got the rich housewives from Salt Lake City. I didn't know, you know, we saw them in Atlanta, whatever other cities, fill in the blank. Maybe soon, you know, coming to a city near you in Fishers, I don't know. There it is. You know, this is what he has suggested, this lifestyle that he went after in these verses. Now I'm going to load this up, these 4 verses, with all of the stuff that we find not only in Ecclesiastes, but also in 1 Kings. And I'm just blown away by all of the things he tried and actually did. Now, all of this is on your handout. By the way, once again, all of the major stuff that's on these slides are on your handout. I don't usually pack PowerPoint slides with a whole bunch of text, but I did here because I feel like when I'm reading this passage in Ecclesiastes that this is exactly what Solomon is doing. He's just dumping one thing after another. I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this. He's just telling, like a Gatling gun across the board, he's trying to fill us in on all of these kinds of things that have been going on. So he's a builder. He's built all of these things. We'll talk more about them specifically in just a moment. He's been a developer of gardens and reservoirs. We're going to talk about this 34-mile gravity drop feed in just a moment. Economic titan. He had slaves, which, by the way, in that world, and just so we are clear about this, slavery continues today, just in case anybody has a query about that. Slavery continues even in our own day today, where racial and ethnic and national groups enslave each other for various reasons. So slavery has not left us. The issue of slaves here, however, is one of servants. So you've got to have all of these people that are running all of these temples and warehouses and cities and taking care of all of this land. So the more slaves you had in the ancient world, the elevated prestige you had in the ancient world. It just showed how powerful you were and how much money you had. Herds and flocks, just think of stocks and bonds. That's exactly what herds and flocks used to mean. Just by the way, 22,000 oxen and 123,000 sheep were sacrificed at the temple dedication. Go read about that in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And when we talk about the gravity drop here in just a moment with all the water, it'll make sense as to why water was needed with all this sacrificing going on. But just imagine the bloodletting that was happening here. And not only that, but how many people there had to be to kill all of these beasts, and then how much food there had to be eaten. All right, verse 8. He was an international monopolist as well. He controlled the trade bridge. We'll talk about that again in a moment. Between Egypt and Mesopotamian River Valley. 25 tons of gold per year, not counting tariffs and tributes. This was something that was coming in regularly. So you go read the backdrop, the background in all of this. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into 1 Kings, but also in Chronicles. Don't forget that. And then he ends by saying, and he had all of these concubines, which were the delight of man. I won't say anything more than that, except to say that the man had tastes that seemed to go beyond anything that certainly any of us has experienced here. So this kind of thing is all Solomon, and this is all of the stuff that he did. An amazing feat, just all of it combined together. But I wanted to say something about this aqueduct because this just blows me away. So here you have from Hebron, which is way down in the south, all the way up to Jerusalem, which is in the north, 34 miles of gravity feed water supply. 34 miles. There were no cranes. There were no bulldozers. Go check this out. This is amazing stuff. And this is the inside, by the way, of one of those aqueducts, which seems very similar to some of those huge plastic, what are those big things? The conduits that have sewers, that we use for sewers in and around even the buildings that are going on here in Fishers. When we talk about Solomon's aqueduct, we are talking about a major feat of engineering that is unbelievable when you stop to consider how long it took, how much work it took, how many people involved. 34 miles of this. And if you have any understanding at all about how important it is to see gravity drop from a height to a lower place and how long it takes to get there, this just blows your mind. So I wanted to say a little bit more about this. Go do some study on this. This is absolutely fascinating what happened here. Just this. All right, let's talk about a little bit of the cultural historic background. And I wanted to just read a few of these verses as we go for each of these sections. So in order for us to understand how much was going on and what was going on, here's 1 Kings 4, 20 and 21. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. Lots of people, huge population. They ate and drank and were happy. Ooh. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms of the Euphrates, from the Euphrates, of the land of the Philistines, the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So this man was a massive ruler of a huge expanse of land mass and over large swaths of people groups. So this is what he's talking about in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Then, when we go on to this next section, we are really, literally talking about personal peace and affluence. So here it is, 22 to 25 in 1 Kings chapter 4. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tipshah to Gaza, over all of the kings west of the Euphrates. And he had peace on all sides around him, which was amazing in that period of time. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan, which is way in the north, even to Beersheba, which is way in the south, every man under his vine and under his fig tree all the days of Solomon. That line, every man under his vine and fig tree, is repeated consistently throughout First Testament teaching, but especially in anticipation of what God would do when he comes again, when Messiah comes back, and everybody's going to have this. Well, this is what Solomon's kingdom had. Everybody was at peace. Everybody had affluence, and they were happy. Now, I just read a bunch about foodstuffs. Look at this. You need 30 to 40,000 people a day to eat all that food. I'm just pausing to let that settle. 30 to 40,000 people per day. What we just read. Now get this. The Queen of Sheba, okay, if we wanted to take some time to read 1 Kings chapter 10, I won't do that right now, but I want to bring some numbers. Some of you people are data people, okay? This is far beyond me, but I actually did some work yesterday to figure this out. Thank you very much. Pat me on the back later, because me and calculators don't get along all that well. So the Queen of Sheba, it says in 1 Kings chapter 10, she brings 120 gold talents. Now this is just one little microscopic group, from Africa. She's bringing this. Everybody else is bringing their stuff, 120. Now a talent weighed 75 pounds. Times 16 ounces. That's 144,000 ounces of gold. Now, I looked this up yesterday. Okay, gold at close of market on Friday was just above $17.50 an ounce. That means in today's marketplace value that this is how much the Queen of Sheba brought. $252 million.
Sure you're not missing a decimal point about this show.
Yeah, we're not messing with decimal points, yep. This is amazing. And I'm stopping and I'm making a point out of this because I want you to realize how much Solomon had. And when we're reading Ecclesiastes chapter 2, what kind of impact this should have on our reading as we consider the implication of this. This is just mind-blowing. He was also, by the way, a superpower of the day. He was his own superpower. It says here in verses 26 and following, in 1 Kings 4, Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses. 40,000 stalls. For his chariots, 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon, for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Barley also and straw for the horses, and swift steeds they brought to the place where it was required, each according to his duty. I mean, your head swims after a while when you stop to consider the implications of this. And as I was texting with a friend yesterday who reminded me that, if you have this much gold, then you've got to have people that take care of the gold, and places to store the gold, and people to guard the gold. Amazing stuff. So, he was his own superpower. And I want you to realize what kind of implications these are. And I'm not going to read all of this text. This is from the 1 Kings passage. But I want you to notice the map in particular. So here's Egypt, right here. And here's the Mesopotamian river valley. So this is where you would have the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians, okay, major powerhouses throughout the ancient world at various times, and then Egypt. And look at where Solomon lived, right here. This is the land bridge. By the way, nobody traveled through the desert. This is all desert. So you don't travel through the desert. There's no helicopters, okay? No Chinooks flying people hither and yon. Here you have this one strip. He controlled it all. The only way Egypt was going to trade with anybody in Babylon or Assyria or Medo-Persia was to go through him. That's where he got all the tribute. That's where he got all of the gold. Amazing stuff. So all of these things that are emphasized here about all of the kings in the earth and the riches and the wisdom, all of this has a geographical impact. And continuing here, he's talking about how much a chariot would be imported for, how much it cost, how he exported things. He was an importer-exporter. Amazing, man. And he did all of this, Ecclesiastes chapter 2. So, a couple of important words here. The word pleasure means all of these things, just general happiness. Could mean any of these things, but just generally being happy. But I wanted you to notice, especially at the end of this passage, where he talks about his reward and the toil that it took to get there. And as far as he's concerned, it's a meager profit, not much to show for a large investment. So when you put all of these Hebrew words together, this is essentially what Solomon is suggesting. It's not even enough to show the investment. And so we end, and this is just right out of Scripture, Then I considered all that my hands had done, the toil I had expended in doing it. Behold, all was vanity, striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Remember what I said right at the beginning? He's stacking these words. Remember what we learned? What vanity means: vapid, void, empty. Striving after the wind. I mean, just picture that. But that occurs 9 times in the book. And then nothing to be gained under the sun 21 times in the book. He's just piling these words on top of each other to end this passage, to say, this is what it was worth, next to nothing. So, let's come back to our culture, to the Declaration of Independence, where we started a few moments ago. And I emphasize this line, which is really just sacred to Americans: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I want you to notice something about what the word used to mean. It didn't mean what we think it means today, like I just get to do what I want. 250 years ago, the word happiness meant virtue. It actually had ethics involved with it. And the whole concept behind virtue was that others mattered more than self. So that if you were really going to be pursuing happiness, you would be pursuing the happiness of others. That your focus would be on others. That's essentially what this was about. So it really turns on its head the whole American concept of, I just want to be happy. And I wanted to suggest this again. I do this every class hour when I'm teaching at university, when we talk about words. And we talk about the power of etymology. Etymology simply means the history of the background of words. It's really important to figure out what words meant when they were originally written. That's why, by the way, the Constitution's really important, because you need to interpret it based on the way it was originally written. It's not a living, breathing document. Did I just say that? Now, this is really important. The compare and contrast. To me, this is the best way to learn. If you want to know why or how Christianity stacks up against anything else, then just compare it with anything else. And in this particular case, I'm suggesting that we define what the word happy means, that we show its source, where does it come from, that its ultimate goal or outcome, and the result of it. What do we get from it? So if we do this, by the way, this is all on the flip side of that page. If we do this kind of compare and contrast between a cultural happiness and a Christian view of happiness, we're going to see a diametrically opposed point of view. And that's what I'm suggesting here with this one slide. Now let's take this a little bit further and suggest, what does the Hebrew say? So the Hebrew word for happy is the word asher. And the very first word in the Psalm starts this way. Happy is the man. And then Psalm 119, 1-3. Happy are those whose way is blameless, whose walk in the law of the Lord, the law of Yahweh. Happy are those who observe his testimonies, who seek him with all their heart. They also do no unrighteousness, and they walk in his ways. So twice in this opening passage in one of the most famous Psalms, Psalm 119, happy are these people. What is happiness? It is the virtue of giving back, the virtue of appreciation. Where is this source coming from? How are we gifted with, and what is the result of all of this happiness? It is not about us. So, on the back, again, I've listed a whole bunch of questions. I think there are 10 of them altogether. And these are questions just to consider, ponder these, reflect on these. How can temporal happiness with no real boundaries be better than the parameters established by the eternal God? Thinking about Ecclesiastes 2, 1-11. Can anything lasting be built solely on happiness? A college education, law, working at a job. What do each of these demand? Is rejecting the Christian worldview because it's hard, both to fully understand and to live, for something easy, for personal peace and affluence, a wise choice? Why or why not? How will your choices for happiness affect others? And how will the decisions for happiness of others affect you? What if others' happiness conflicts with your own? Will you be able to say, don't do that, you'll ruin my happiness? How will you make future decisions based on happiness? Can nations, economies, cultures, or daily life be sustained by happiness as a goal? How are individual experiential choices different from selfishness? And is choice a servant or a master? Is choice a servant or a master? All of these things I present to us here today to just give an understanding of how our culture is so different from the culture in which Solomon was living and writing these words and living what he lived in the way that he did in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, 1 to 11. So we've got a little bit of time here at the end. Comments or questions?
Can you elaborate a little more on where you get that happiness had that meaning with others 250 years ago?
From 250 years ago? Right. Yeah, so I went back and did some study about what the founders actually meant and what were they reading at that particular time. So they were reading folks like Cicero, and Cicero was important in terms of how he defined that word virtue, and literally they were taking from some of these sources that kind of verbiage. So out of the ancients, the ancient pagan philosophers, the founders were taking these words and they were applying them then to the text. You can read about this, just generally speaking, in the that book. What is that book? The Background to the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. Yeah. Took me just a minute.
And then a follow-up.
Yep.
You mentioned the word virtue. Would that be a better way for us to think about that phrase today in modern terms?
Yeah, I'm smiling because for years I've talked about the word value being a weak word because value only tells us what we do. Virtue suggests what we should do. So there's a big difference between what we do and what we should do. Should suggests an ethical base, some kind of background or foundation to which we base our right and wrong on. So I think it's be much more powerful to talk about, let's say, for instance, if you're going to start a company, and instead of talking about the values of your company, talk about the virtues of your company, because it has an ethical sense to it that the word value does not have. I did not pay the man beforehand to ask these questions, but these are great questions to ask. Anybody else? Other thoughts, questions?
Where does the notion come from that we should have like company values? You know, because just about all of our employers are touting the values, and it almost always includes it's a big topic. But what's the history of that? Where does that come from?
Yeah. Be honest with you, I don't really know in terms of modern business, modern Western business practices, or universal business practices for that matter. Maybe some of you would know that better than I would. But I would say, again, that there are the weak words, I call them weak words. They are morals and values. And the strong words are virtue and ethics. Because the latter two words give a foundation for ought or should, whereas values simply says this is what we do. This is our practice. So is the value, let's take an extreme and awful example, is the value of human trafficking something that we want to espouse? Well, obviously not. We would not espouse such a thing. But it would be better for us to say we stand against human trafficking because of the virtue of the dignity and worth and value of the individual person, coming out of Genesis 1. So about the business side of things, I don't know. I'd have to go do some study on that one.
It seems like it's an opportunity to talk about morality in a way that we couldn't like 10 years ago.
Right.
15 years ago. Because the notion of, company values, they're now selling religion. They're selling morality, and that was not the case, when many of us started the workforce. So it's problematic, but it also seems like an opportunity too.
Yep, absolutely. And who's Who's going to say what those values are? That's the real issue here. The real issue isn't so much that there are values, but who gets to tell you what those values might be. That's going to be the crucial issue. And to your point, you get to speak into that issue.
Mark, I think that a lot of the business side of it came after World War II, when people like Dr. Deming went back to Japan and saw their industrial, setup that they had there, and how they ran businesses and how the employees were treated. I think today, though, that there's less value actually placed on individual employees and more value placed upon the company above all.
Right. And the bottom line.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that the employees, at least it's been my experience, are, how can I say this without sounding so crass? We're like an adding machine or a file cabinet. We are expendable, we are assets.
Right.
If you look at the way that the language has changed over the years, you go to get a job, where do you go? Well, back in the 50s, you went to personnel.
Right.
Right? Later it became human resources. And now it's human capital.
Yeah.
Is the way that businesses refer to individuals.
Right.
Human capital. You are as valuable as whatever you can provide the company at the time. And you fail to provide that or are unable to provide that anymore, then your value as an individual decreases.
Yeah, you're expendable.
Exactly.
The big difference between worldviews here is really powerful to suggest. The worldview that says that naturalism, that what you see is what you get, is all that there is, that's a production-minded mindset. So we want you to be producers. If you can't produce anymore, we'll send you out to pasture or whatever. The Hebraic Christian worldview, however, says that we base who you are based on your personhood, not your production. And there's a huge difference between those concepts.
Yeah, Mark, I was just gonna make the point that I love that last question, because, I mean, that speaks to just the entire mindset in this country, right? I mean, everything is about convenience, and choice is the master,
Right.
right?
And I find this in my students who will sign up for a course that they take from me and from other professors, and then they will complain when they have work to do. Because they have made a choice to be there, and don't I know that they have a family and a job, but you made a choice. So your choice is that you wanted to take this class. So now you have the choice of, okay, you do the work for the class, or you drop the class because it's too much. It's okay if you do, I get that, not a big deal. But don't tell me it's my fault. Thank you very much.
Mark, on the two extremes of pleasure, I couldn't help but think of the movie Titanic and how Jim Cameron demonstrates that, where after Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio engage in your option 2, the wining and dining, he says, do you want to go to a real party?
Yeah.
They go downstairs to version 1.
Yep.
Yours.
Yeah.
This is a nice dichotomy he presents.
It is, and since you bring up a movie, I have to say, I base one whole course that I teach on the Korean Joon-ho movie Parasite. And the whole point of this movie is classism. So you've got these different classes. And now my course and my students are actually investigating this for themes and so on, which is a whole discussion. But the issue of class, absolutely. People are going to take that in any way that they can make it happiness for them. But nonetheless, it is true across the board. Doesn't matter who you are, where you live, everybody's going to find that pleasure.
I've never wished, I've got 3 middle-aged children. No, I think they're middle-aged, yeah, they are. I've never wished them to be happy, as you articulated. I have maybe articulated that they'd be content. Would you care to make a comment about that? I'm starting to believe that maybe my wish for them to be content is just a relaxed form of happiness. Contrast contentment
Right.
with happiness.
Yeah, I think it's rather biblical, your point. right out of the book of Philippians, the issue of being content with what you have and what you don't have. Paul's famous line, you know, I've been in places where I'm in want, and I've been in places where I've had everything I've needed. And he finds contentment in both of those places. So contentment, or the essence of what it means to respond properly to all of the goodness that we have around us, is to be satisfied with where we're at. Our struggle, my struggle, is that I'm not always satisfied, and I wish for more. Solomon teaches, it ain't worth it, baby. See you next week.